It's, I guess it's December 1st, right?
Yes, it is.
2003. Brian Comerford in conversation with Kenneth Comerford. We're just going to start talking about your metaphysical background. I'd like to start with discussing a little bit about your involvement in the military, what you did during the Korean War, stationed on the DEW line, your first exposure to UFOs, and I want to know if that had anything to do with your developing interest in metaphysics.
I don't know that it had anything to do with metaphysics, but it had something to do with the concept of UFOs. I was in 64th Air Division, North Air Defense Command, also known as the Distant Early Warning Line, the DEW line, in St. John's, Newfoundland, Pepperell Air Force Base. I was a cryptographer, which meant that I had a cryptographic clearance, top secret clearance, so on. And we would receive information from other entities on the DEW line, or in this case, at that time, there was a lot of information about the Hungarian revolt and the Russian tanks coming in and squelching them. And at any rate, we got a transmission. I don't remember the date or the exact details, except that the jet fighters were in the air somewhere near Newfoundland, and they observed an unidentified flying object that they pursued to attempt to identify. And they went as fast as those jets in the mid-50s could go. And they were, I don't remember in terms of Mach what it was, but they were after the sound barrier had been broken and like that. So they pursued this flying object, hoping to identify it, and it just sort of stayed with them for a while, and then at some point it just moved away and left them sitting there. So the transmission was to the effect that this is incredible. The speed of this object is just something that we've never observed before, and it's far faster than anything that we have ever recorded before.
Was this the only incident of that kind, or were there other incidents that happened subsequent to this?
It's the only one when I was on duty. I don't know, because we all had clearances, and it was always confidential, and it always went straight to the head shed. So that's the only one that I handled myself. There may have been others, obviously, probably were, but I can't attest to any of that. And I was never supposed to, we were sworn not to ever say anything about it while we were in the service or ever after. But of course, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. So after you got out of the military, you became friends with Colonel Burks, and was that the beginning of your interest in metaphysical studies?
It was the beginning of my interest in reincarnation, I think. This was, the Air Force experience was in the mid-50s. The experiences of being interested in UFOs continued. And of course, I was always interested in motivation, decision-making, leadership skills, anything that called upon the higher mind or higher intelligence. So at the Orange Show in San Bernardino, about the mid-60s, maybe 66, I came upon a booth where the people, the name of shop was Allen's Bookshelf, Mentone, California. And they had books about universal mind and other metaphysical subjects, as well as UFO subjects. I had, in the interim, I should say that I had read the George Adamski books and found that the higher philosophy was what I imagined it should be. It was about goodness and excuse me. It was about goodness. It was about things that you might attribute to the qualities of our Creator. And yet it was cast in this metaphysical arena, UFOs that land as spaceships have landed and this kind of thing. Well, I don't know what ever happened in terms of that, but George Adamski, interestingly, Adamski means son of Adam, had a place on Mount Palomar in Southern California. He had a big telescope. He also participated in UFO conventions in Southeast California, out in a desert where they had a giant rock landing strip, and so some of that was leading up to this. When I attended the show, the Orange Show, and met the lady, June Brockway was her name, but she and her husband, Jim Brockway, had bought out a metaphysical bookstore called Allen's Bookshelf, and they had all these books about the other dimensions, mystical things, universal mind, as I say. They were part of an organization that featured a man named Fry, and Fry was one of those who was in a higher position with the government and knew something about UFOs. So I was immediately interested in it and stopped and talked with her, chatted with her at length. She invited me to become part of their group called Understanding Incorporated, and Fry was the leader of that group. So, in attending the meetings of the group, I met a podiatrist named Dr. Fred Andrews from Redlands, California, and I was also referred to Colonel Arthur J. Burks, retired USMC. Colonel Burks was probably in his 60s at that time, and he gave prior life readings. So Colonel Burks ignited my interest in reincarnation because he gave me a couple of readings over a period of time. He was not from San Bernardino, but he visited as a guest of the Understanding Inc. And the first reading he gave me, as I recall, he told me about a lifetime in Spain in which I was the patron of a large ranch, Rancho Cordoba, in the western province of Extremadura. On that ranch, we raised fighting bulls for the bull ring. We had agriculture and other cattle and so on, but it was a Western type ranch akin to what you might run into in West Texas or Arizona or northern Mexico. In the course of that reading, he told me incidences about the lifetime. The name was Enrique Dulaves, or Dos Laves, and he gave it to me as Dulaves, which is, having been born in Barcelona, is closer to France, so Dulaves meant two Laves, and so does Dos Laves, which came up later. In the course of my work with Dr. Fred Andrews then, Andrews had discovered regressive hypnosis. He had attended a medical hypnotherapy class and instruction, and he became skilled in regressing patients to try and find the source of their illnesses. He stumbled on to the fact that sometimes it went back before this life. In other words, in regressing people to determine the source of their illnesses, he found out that it was sometimes before they were born in this life. So he became very interested in the metaphysics. His family had come from Hemet. He was raised as a member of the LDS Church, a Mormon. He did not have any interest in metaphysics or UFOs until he stumbled on this. And so a small group of us began meeting weekly. Dr. Andrews and I had read Maury Bernstein's book about Bridie Murphy. And that had happened not too long before, but it had opened the door to regressive hypnosis into prior lives. So we would meet with our small group, and we discovered, actually Dr. Andrews discovered a subject that was particularly able to travel into the spiritual world and speak to us from a position other than her current understanding, which was as a housewife in Riverside, California. So it evolved to Dr. Andrews learning that there were different shades of light, that beings were beings of light, and that if you were a white light, you were more evolved than a yellow light or a green light, for example. And I suppose it has something to do with auras as the way we perceive it in this world. But at any rate, she seemed to be a white light and knew more than others in the regression situation. So we would ask her questions, and she would respond from the depth of her understanding, her higher consciousness, that part of her which I've since decided is the part that we all are part of God. That God has created all of us and does not stand outside of us, as some of the religious figures contend, but that everything that is exists in the mind of the Creator, not outside, but within and without, you might say. Within the mind of the Creator, everything exists and is expressed outward in the many dimensions of life. And there are more than this dimension and the so-called heaven dimension. There are at least 7 that our research has indicated to us. Well, we learned many things from our experience in that little group. The group grew. Dr. Andrews began advertising seminars on hypnotic regression and prior life regression, and people would come from various parts of Southern California to participate. And at one such seminar, my wife accompanied me at my insistence. And Diane was not predisposed to believe in reincarnation or any of the stuff, metaphysical stuff, beyond just a curiosity about UFOs. Well, when she was regressed by Dr. Andrews, she seemed to be the perfect subject. She easily described prior life situations. She easily moved into the area between lives on Earth and described what her perception was of life as a spirit being rather than as a spirit inhabiting a body. And she could also remember, for instance, she could remember being in a small town in the west of Spain in an area called Rancho Cordoba, and she remembered being a nun, a young nun, like not much more than an adolescent, early teens. And she could remember some of the people that she was with in that convent in Rancho Cordoba. So it turns out that some of these people were drawn to this group that had been in Rancho Cordoba. And the Mother Superior that Diane was with turns out to be a woman that she worked with at Lockheed Propulsion in Redlands. And her name was Isabella Anderson. So through Isabella, she had developed a friendship, had nothing to do with the prior life connection. But at one of Dr. Andrews' seminars, lo and behold, there's Isabella and her husband, Carl Anderson. And
this wasn't prompted by you or Diane for them to attend? They just found out about it on their own?
No, that's exactly right. We had nothing to do with it. Diane knew Isabel, as she was called, but no, they didn't talk about this kind of thing, and they were surprised to see each other at one of Dr. Andrews' groups, and it became a very interesting situation for Carl and Isabel Anderson and Ken and Diane Comerford, because at some point Carl watched Dr. Andrews regressing other people, and he saw me also speak at these seminars, workshops, regression sessions, and asked me after one of them if I would come to his home and regress him into prior life. So I agreed to, and I suspect he asked me because maybe there was a sense of kinship, or maybe he felt intimidated by Dr. Andrews. I don't know. But anyway, he asked us to his home in Yucaipa. So we went there, and we had Kevin with us, our eldest son, who was just a toddler at that time, but we had kind of a barbecue and a nice afternoon in Yucaipa at the Anderson home. And then we went inside, and he laid down on the couch, and I relaxed him to help him move within and away from the conscious mind into the higher consciousness, in which you find the truth for yourself. I asked him questions to get him back into prior life situations, and he had been in Louisiana and had been shot to death. He was in a pirogue on the bayou, and this is not a song, but this was the setting that he saw, that he was probably a half-caste person in the Cajun country of Louisiana. And for some reason, there had been some animosity developed between him and somebody else, and he was kind of partying. He was actually, according to him, he was intoxicated while he was in this pirogue, this small boat out on the bayou, and he was shot by someone from shore and killed. And he was maybe 18 or so. The next life was at a time when the British and French were having battles at sea, and he was a young seaman, again in the 1820 age range, and he was killed in battle at sea, and one of these warship encounters between the British and French. I believe he was on the French side. He told me, but it's been a long time ago. The third life that he went to, and normally you don't regress people more than one or two, but he was so young both of those times. He was intoxicated both of those times, and he was killed both of those times in Louisiana and at sea. So the third life, I asked him to go back to birthday celebration when he was a boy, because that's usually not upsetting. And he did, and he talked about being on a big ranch. He talked about his father worked with the bulls, and he said that his name was Gonzalez, and that he was named after the patron, so his name was Enrique Gonzalez. And as we progressed him forward, he said that he saw his father gored to death by one of the bulls that was being prepared for the bull ring, one of the brave bulls that Spain is, in those days, this was 19th century. And after he had seen his father gored to death, he developed an aversion for working with the bulls. Well, as we went on through this, asking questions and getting his responses, I still didn't understand that the patron being named Enrique, and I didn't make the connection yet myself with the reading I'd received from Colonel Burke's, in which my name was Enrique also, Enrique Dulaves, and born in Barcelona, but a patron in Extremadura. So at some point, I asked him more about the ranch, more about who was there, and he talked about the patron that he was named after, and he told me the patron's name was Enrique dos Laves. This coincided, of course, with the reading that Colonel Burks had given me. So I thought, we're on to something here. Because until you can confirm something, it's still kind of like some kind of fantasy land, some kind of imaginary stuff. You just don't know. You're working with prior life regression, you're studying metaphysics and mystical Christianity, and still you have to have some kind of an experience before you really confirm and solidify any kind of a belief system related to it. So we explored it further. Turns out that this man, Carl Anderson, being regressed to Enrique Gonzalez back in the 19th century, the 1800s, had also known Diane, who was in the convent, and they knew each other. And presumably Carl knew, Enrique Gonzalez knew Isabella, who was the Mother Superior, because he became kind of a drugstore cowboy, kind of a flirt, and he was particularly drawn to the ladies at the convent. And of course, in the 20th century, he was married to Isabella. So it was interesting because Carl was already in his 40s when this happened, and he died subsequently in his late 40s, but he was an alcoholic again, but he was a gentle man. I mean, he was not, there was no meanness or criminal activity or anything like that. It was just the lifestyle. He grew up in New Mexico and was a guitar player in a country and western band, and that's kind of like he was in Rancho Cordova. He became a drugstore cowboy. He liked to play his guitar and dress and pretend ranch dress attire, and he wasn't a real cowboy because he was afraid of the bulls, but what he did was appeal to the ladies, and he had a charm about him, and so everything kind of came together in terms of that life. After Carl was out of regression, he remembered a lot of stuff. And Diane subsequently being regressed to that life, and both of them just remembered a lot of things other than what they were asked under hypnosis. They remembered a lot of things, and they also were able to travel together in the other world as spiritual beings, and brought back a lot of information about true life, life between the physical expression on Earth. So we got a great deal of experience through the lifetimes in Spain. It's interesting that we moved to San Francisco area, and let's see, it was latter part of 1969. I'm trying to remember exactly, but I think we moved there in November, December, January. I started the job in January in San Francisco of 1969. So we had this earlier experience in 1967, and we were part of that group for a period of time. I mean, it evolved into the study group on reincarnation, regression, but we were part of that group for a couple of years. Then we left, and in further contacts with Dr. Andrews, who was still in Redlands at that time, we learned that they had run into other people who, under regression, remembered being on Rancho Cordova. And this was, again, was without suggestion from Dr. Andrews, because Andrews wasn't there himself. But when he regressed other people, and they said, well, there was a young couple that under regression that they were in the Peace Corps in this life, working in Mexico with illiterate, underprivileged youth. And they remembered this experience in Extremadura on Rancho Cordova, where they had been asked by Enrique dos Laves to educate the children of the ranch hands and to make them literate. And so they lived on the ranch. They didn't know Enrique dos Laves that well, but under regression by Dr. Andrews, they told them about their experience on the ranch. And of course, that too coincided with what I had learned, what Diane had learned, and what Carl Anderson had learned and shared.
I'm curious about a few things. One in particular, I'm curious to know if Diane was already aware of some of the things that had come up in Carl's readings, or vice versa, which might have influenced them in knowing, or if this was something that just sort of came to a head for everyone simultaneously. And then another thing is, was there ever any work done to try to look up historical records in Spain to find out if there were in fact, historical records of these people with these names or these places?
Well, as for the first part of the question, Carl was totally unaware of anything that I knew about Spain or my reading with Colonel Burks. He had no knowledge of that at all. He was a newcomer to the group. I can't say for sure that somebody else might have known, but Colonel Burks gave confidential readings, and June Brockway and Dr. Fred Andrews are the ones that introduced me to Understanding Inc., and it was through Colonel Burks giving me a reading in that context that I became aware of some prior life experiences. Now, Diane did not share in my new understanding of reincarnation at that time. having been raised Catholic, she had her own system of beliefs, and even though we had each attended Catholic church for some time, at that time we were not practicing Catholics, but still, that was her upbringing, and she didn't come willingly to this subject. Her interest was developed when she had been in a serious accident and coming home from work in Redlands and was broadsided by a big, heavy Buick while she was in her little Chevy Camaro, and it just about killed her. So while she was in a hospital at St. Bernardine's Hospital, a priest did consult with her, and everybody knew that she was in bad shape, and she, they prayed together, and she didn't receive last rites, but it was meaningful to her to have the priest spend considerable time with her and help with the healing process. And for whatever reason, she would have to tell you, but she asked me to find some books on UFOs and bring them to her in the hospital and later when she got home, so that she could read about a couple of subjects, in particular, a couple of books that she asked for. So we did that, and that kind of drew me in again with the Adamski books and so on. So she had that much of an interest in UFOs, none in reincarnation, and thought that when I started meeting with the group, Fred Andrews' group, that it was basically the devil's work. So she didn't come willingly into it. She knew Carl Anderson's wife, but at Lockheed, but they never discussed anything metaphysical. They didn't share any information at all about that. In fact, I don't know that Diane knew everything that I did yet at that point. But I kept trying to convince her that she should come and just open her mind enough to hear some of this stuff. So she came finally, grudgingly. That's when she recognized Isabel as a co-employee. But the amazing thing that happened was that she became a subject of prior life regression, and that she was a fast subject. I mean, she may have been the most rigid in the group, opposed to reincarnation and all of this stuff that was going on, but she became an easy subject under hypnosis. And what I mean by that, easy is to get into the higher consciousness, to get into a spiritual mode. Many people find it difficult, even under regression, to give up being who they are and in the physical world, and they won't just release that physical mind or conscious mind and the five senses to find out what the sixth sense may offer. They cling too much to the world and just can't get over that hump. Well, she immediately went right over it, and boom, she began understanding prior lives and the lives in between. Now, she hadn't known Carl Anderson, and I hadn't either. But since she knew Isabel, and then Carl became part of our little group that studied with the lady who Fred called the White Light. Her name was Rita Conover, and she was from Riverside, California. But Fred called her the White Light because of the level of truth that came through her. She seemed to be more highly evolved than other subjects. So in our little group, Carl started to meet with us, and as I said before, at some point he felt confident enough to ask me to regress him. But in our little group, we never discussed Enrique de Slavis. That had happened between me and Colonel Burks. Our little group was Dr. Fred Andrews, myself, Rita Conover, and her husband, Ken Conover. And they were from Riverside, and he owned a franchise selling motorcycles like Harley Davidsons and that sort of thing. And remember, this is back in the late 60s when they were quite popular in the Riverside area, and the wild ones came from just west of Riverside. Anyway, Fontana, and that area is where the Hells Angels originated. So being in the motorcycle business, he was successful and not necessarily a spiritual person himself, a nice guy, but he was horrified as we eventually unfolded the life of Dos Laves after Carl had become aware of it. And then it sort of was something we did share with the group. And he was horrified because Dos Laves and Gonzalez, the two Enriques, came to a bitter ending. And that ending was that because he was Carl Anderson, a.k.a. Enrique Gonzalez, became a drugstore cowboy, and he was a drunken, misbehaving, poor influence on the people at the ranch and the ladies in the nunnery. And so Enrique Dos Laves ordered his men to discipline young Gonzalez. And they did so, and in the course of which they dragged him by a rope. And it was to punish him and rough him up, but his head hit a rock, and he became very spiritual very quickly. Ken Conover thought that was murder. Carl Anderson told him not at all. And this is Carl Anderson in his conscious mind talking after revealing some of these circumstances. He said, not at all. He had been afraid to work with the bulls. He had disobeyed the patron. He had gone into town and become a drunk and was a bad influence. And so he was being disciplined, and it was perfectly normal. That was the law. The patron was the law. So he had no ill feelings at all. He felt like he deserved it, and he straightened Ken Conover out on that one.
So back to the second part of my question, was there any outside investigation ever done into trying to identify whether or not you could track down these historical people, historical places?
Well, not in the sense that you would do it today. In the late 60s, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the World Wide Web, we didn't have easy resources, and it's very difficult. We tried, but not being researchers ourselves, and not having a lot of time, because between working as a deputy probation officer in Riverside County and pursuing this metaphysical study, and the time given to the meetings, and also to educating my probationers in positive approaches to life, which is a little bit of another story. But at any rate, we attempted a few things, tried to find out a few things, and didn't come up with anything except Rancho Cordova existed in Extremadura in the west of Spain. It's interesting that my younger brother Bob was in the Air Force and was sent to Spain, where he lived for 3 years, and that he never approached any understanding of metaphysics. But in Seville, he experienced going down a street, knowing exactly where he was going, and he'd never been there before. And he went to a cantina, and he went right to it even though it was like 3 or 4 blocks from where he started, I guess. And he had no knowledge of the city. He was new, and he went there. He knew, and he recognized everything along the way. Well, he never professed any deep religious or philosophical feelings, and he just told me about it as it's an incident that he was surprised that everything was so familiar to him. Well, of course, he was on the ranch. He was one of my brothers on that ranch, and it was a family-owned ranch. And after our father had passed, then I was the eldest brother. And, my father's brother, my uncle, and a couple of my brothers, under my supervision as the patron, we operated the ranch. So my brother and I were together again in this life, and he shared that with me. I didn't even know anything about all of this at that time.
Why do you think that there is a tendency, at least in these experiences that you've had, for people to remain intimates throughout these various incarnations? And based on your understanding of reincarnation, is that something that's relatively consistent, or is it unique to these recollections that you and this group had?
Well, there's what I believe about it, and there may be something else. But what I believe about it is that basically, if you've lived enough lives, you know just about everybody. That may sound like too broad a statement, but remember, everybody's reincarnating. So we all come back. And we come back in the same family often. Sometimes there's a newcomer, sometimes there's somebody that's there for a different purpose. And it may even be a negative purpose, but or it could be a very positive purpose. And they're in and out of our little group. But I find that in my psychic meditational world that we don't experience home, meaning our real home, our spiritual home. We don't all experience it the same way. I mean, there are different consciousness, and you're more likely to have the same consciousness as someone that you've been a friend, family member, had prior experience with. So your mother and I, Diane and I, remember a lifetime as Vikings. Well, she was my woman, and I was the Viking leader. There were some interesting things about that life that don't have anything to do with your question, but we both have some memory of that life. We also have some memory of a time in England when Henry was the king, and we have some memory of Spain. We have some memory, she also had a different life in Spain where she was Jewish. And we have memories of a lifetime in England, which was earlier in this century, in which I was a young man who I was born in 1896. She would have been a couple of years younger. And we were in London, and I went to Oxford. My father was a landlord or a realtor or, whatever they would have called it at that time. So real estate law and so on. So I went to Oxford. I got a law degree, and I was called into service in the Royal Army, and I left her behind. She was an art student, much as she is today, very artistic. But she remained behind when I went off to war, and I was killed in France in 1918. I was a patrol leader, and we were marching on the German forces, and it was pretty rough stuff. I mean, you're between trenches, and you go through over no man's land trying to take an advantage of people that are dug in on the other side, and I was shot. And even though my physical body fell, I did not know it. I thought I was still the patrol leader, and I was leading my patrol against this German position. And I was killed, and yet I kept moving forward thinking that I was leading my troops, and they already knew that I was gone, of course, but I didn't for at least a few moments. And I also remember feeling great resentment about God, if you will, but I brought that into this life. The resentment stemmed from the fact that I had been a good student. I had disciplined myself. I had made honors, and I had graduated from law school at Oxford and had everything before me. Lovely young woman who loved me, fine, sensitive, artistic woman that I was in love with, and I was called into the Army, and at the ripe old age of 22, I lay dead on a battlefield in a war that idealistically I had no interest in. I brought that into this life, and it took me several years to figure it out. But I have since healed that resentment, having recognized it, but I'm sure there are other people like me that felt like something very wonderful was snatched away from them for no good reason.
Do you feel like that might have some influence on why you became a cryptologist in the military in this life instead of a combat person, or was that something completely outside of your control?
Well, I was an asthmatic in this life, and I wasn't fit to be in the infantry. I, in fact, went into the Air Force thinking that I could get away with my asthmatic condition, even though I would be somewhere other than Arizona where I felt okay. And turns out I spent 2.5 years in St. John's, Newfoundland, in a very damp, cold climate without suffering any ill effects. But yes, I avoided going into the infantry, preferring to go into Air Force intelligence and become an operator in the cryptographic system.
Do you know anything about how Colonel Burks was introduced into his interests in reincarnation, and did that have anything to do with his military connections?
Well, when he was a young man, he was a pulp fiction writer. Now, I say young man, I don't know when, the civilian life and the military life. He didn't tell me an awful lot about himself, but at the time he was a pulp fiction writer, his roommate was L. Ron Hubbard. And L. Ron Hubbard developed the system of Scientology and wrote, pulp fiction and several things of a higher level. I don't know why he was in the Marine Corps or what happened to him in the Marine Corps or any of those kinds of things. But all that he shared of his personal life was that he and L. Ron Hubbard were young men that were struggling to make a few dollars to live on, and they shared the same apartment and were friends. I think that they came to some parting, not necessarily hostilities, but some parting of the ways because of changes in philosophy. Colonel Burks wrote a book called The Wisdom Pool, and that would be similar to Casey's Akashic record. In other words, there's a wisdom pool that may be accessed when you have achieved a higher consciousness. You know about every thought that ever was, or that's possible. And one of the things he did on our last meeting, he told me that he would like me to have a copy of his book, and he would arrange with the publisher to send me a free copy, and that his perception was that someone needs to take over his work. And as I say, he was an older man. I was in my mid-30s, he was in his mid-60s. And his perception of me was that I was a white light, and that I was a person well-equipped because of my background as a probation officer and having been in Air Force intelligence and having been more than just a psychic freak or something, metaphysical, or somebody that wasn't well grounded. In other words, the word he used is some of the things that I'm going to do would be considered to be on the lunatic fringe. And he said it is not as if you are on the lunatic fringe, you're just going to be innovating and doing things that are strange. So you have to be well grounded and be able to establish credibility and be able to be believable, at least by some people, who would be receptive. And of course, since I had a probation caseload at that time, and I was working to teach them success habits, improving self-image, setting goals in life, and things like that, and also relying on the higher consciousness without calling it God, just relying on that part of yourself that survives.
So this was during the mid to late 60s, which means that in the midst of the psychedelic revolution, you weren't out smoking dope and taking LSD. Instead, you were actually working as a probation officer.
That's correct. I never touched LSD. I took medication for my asthmatic and allergy conditions. I concede that before marriage that I'd smoked a few joints and that I had popped a couple of speeds, but that's all. Just you could put everything in your hand that I ever did, in a handful. And that was part of what made me more down to earth, I think, because I was kind of an intellectual sort of a guy, and there had to be an earthy side of me to relate to guys that were on probation and for me to help change their lives, which was what I was trying to do, and in some cases I did.
And you had mentioned that some of that work had been done in conjunction with work that Fred Andrews was doing.
Well, Fred Andrews had a hobby of motivation, teaching motivation. So that's why he came to help me with my group. I set the group up outside of the probation department. It was my own idea. I did not ask permission. I did not do it on company time. I didn't do it on company premises, and there was no element of force. Nobody had to come. I offered it as a class that would help people learn success habits. Fred Andrews taught basically sales people how to motivate themselves to be successful in sales. And this was an avocation because he was a podiatrist, a medical doctor specializing in foot care.
Good grounded.
Yeah. Well grounded. And as I said, he was from the LDS background in Hemet, California, where he was raised. So he was not at all unorthodox until he found out that through medical hypnosis that people slipped into another life and another time. So yes, he and I worked together. I asked him to consider it, and he didn't even hesitate. He said, I'd love to. So he would come, and when he came to our meetings, we would just pass a hat or something just to reimburse him something for his time. Of course, I didn't take anything, but we might get $5, we might get $10, and after the meeting, which was always like from 7 to 9 or something like that, he and I would go to an IHOP or someplace where we'd have a late sandwich or omelet or something, and we'd discuss what had happened. So, yeah, he did that very willingly. Not for any big bucks, but just to try and help me to help the probationers on my caseload that I thought that I could help. You can't help them all. I mean, anybody that has murderers or severe child molesters or people that are habitual criminals, there's very little that you can do from the position of being a probation officer, because you're being asked to be an officer of the court, and you're representing the court and the law, and you're not supposed to be buddies, and you had to present be in a leadership position, and couldn't fraternize with the troops, so to speak. But I did counsel them, and I did everything I could to help them accept what they'd gotten, responsibility for what they'd gotten themselves into, and what they could do about it to improve their livelihood. And I did it without being judgmental. Granted, they'd been before a judge. Granted, they'd been sentenced. And I didn't treat them like they were jerks or totally bad guys, because everybody's got good in them and everybody's got bad in them. I mean, everybody screws up, everybody succeeds. You don't do it all the time, but you do both. And I just worked with that without presenting myself as some authority figure, just a leader and teacher.
Did it ever come up that you wanted to have some of these people regressed as well, or was that simply outside of what you were doing?
It was outside of it. There was one fellow who I don't remember what he was convicted of, but it was not anything really serious. It was a misdemeanor. And I remember him being in my office, and he was such a nice guy, very withdrawn, not able to converse very easily. But as he sat across my desk from me, and I focused on what he was saying and listened to him and everything, just a white light developed to the point where I couldn't even see his physical being anymore, and he was only 3 or 4 feet away from me. And all I saw was this glowing white light, and I knew, that was kind of a message to me that this is a good man. And maybe his parents didn't do it for him, but you might be able to help salvage this guy. So, as long as you're focused, that light stays there, and then you kind of blink your eyes and look away, and he's back. But that was some experience for me. I didn't tell him that had happened, but I worked with him a little differently after that. Then there were a couple of other guys. There was one guy that was basically uneducated, tradesman, that he liked to talk about Gibran. And I didn't know what Gibran meant, but it turns out that he meant Khalil Gibran, and he loved Khalil Gibran's sayings. And I think he led me to study Khalil Gibran's prophet. And, you can't be all bad. The guy can't be all bad when he's focused on Gibran and helping his probation officer to learn a few things too. And there was another guy that was a transcendentalist. That's what he called himself. I guess he'd studied Emerson or something. I don't know, because he wasn't too articulate. But when I tried to get him to set goals and asked him what he wanted to be. He said he wanted to be a transcendentalist. Well, then you might ask some questions about, well, do you believe in reincarnation or any of that stuff? And, you might get into it sideways and not pursue it very deeply. They are always in a vulnerable position when they're on probation and they're sitting across from the authority figure. So obviously it's not easy to strike some accord where people can be honest with each other. But I was never so open as to discuss metaphysics freely as two students might do. No.
Can you describe the process of taking someone into a regression session, and then also at what point did you feel confident from being a subject into being someone who you felt could be a guide to help bring people into that, as well as Dr. Andrews?
Well, I feel more comfortable being a guide than I do being a subject. Being a guide, being a counselor, being a person as in a helping profession, basically all my life, professional life, that comes pretty natural to me. And I'm bright enough to see what Fred Andrews was doing and to understand it. And I met with this little nuclear group, weekly. And the process that he used was basically medical hypnosis, but going another few steps beyond. So in hypnosis, you relax a person, you get them into a comfortable position. Often it's lying on a sofa. You ask them to loosen any clothing that creates some tension against their body so that they can relax completely. And then what you're trying to do is get them out of their conscious thinking mind to relax into non-thinking and just letting things flow. So you do that by taking them through a drill that's about relaxing different parts of their body. You start at their head, you move through the muscles and parts of their body, relaxing and feeling very relaxed, and you're more and more relaxed, and you feel very comfortable, and you feel very good, and you go right on down to the tiptoes, relaxing their body. And then while you're in this very relaxed state, the best thing to suggest is usually, I would like you to go back now to a very happy event in your childhood. Let's say it's your 6th birthday or a birthday. Maybe the 6th wasn't too good, so you don't like to say which one, but your birthday when you were a child and you were having a very good time. And in their mind, they're responding to the control voice that they keep hearing. If you were totally relaxed yourself without a control voice leading you, you'd just go to sleep. Or you'd go into some kind of deep meditation, but you wouldn't answer any questions. You'd just feel good. So by guiding and being in that control position, you ask questions. You're always very careful not to ask questions that might lead a person into any kind of distress. So you lead them back to their childhood, and after you're successful with re-experiencing a birthday at a young age, preschool, happy relationships, everything's nice, lovely. And do you remember when you were in the nursery at the hospital? How did your father look at you when he came to see you through the nursery window? And you'd be amazed. People have an answer. They tell you. So then you say, let's go back even further. And remember, up till now, everything has been very relaxed, very happy. It's all in this lifetime. But now we're going to go back even further. We're going to go back to a time before this life. A time when you felt very happy, very good. And you were enjoying, might be a birthday party, or you were enjoying some event. And sometimes they will come up with it right away, and sometimes they won't. So if they don't, there's a couple of techniques. I regressed a Lockheed engineer at his request in his house. He sent his wife out for the night, asked me to come over and do a regression. Well, he was an engineer at Lockheed. We went down in his rec room, which was in the basement. He laid out on the sofa. I regressed him. I could not get him to go back past incidents in this life. And he kept, when I would try to get him to see other things, he would just come up with, like he was looking at some kind of a schematic or some kind of a graph or something, you know. I even told him to look in the mirror, and he saw these lines like you might see on a graph sheet, you know, graphic paper. And I thought, I don't know what to do with this guy. So I said, I'd like you to just imagine yourself in a very beautiful scene. You're in the Sierras. And remember, this is in California, so everybody knows what the Sierras is. And you're in a mountain environment. I mentioned Sierras, but then I kind of just didn't keep it Sierras, but just a mountain environment. And you're walking down a path, and you're in sort of a wilderness. It's not total wilderness. There's a pathway, and you're walking down towards this mountain lake. And you see some birds on the water there, some waterfowl. And as you're walking down, tell me what you see. And so he started to get into it a little bit. He told me that there were, I guess I didn't suggest the birds. I think he told me that there were birds on the water, waterfowl on the water. So I got him there, and he wouldn't go anywhere else on his own. So I asked him to look at his feet and see what kind of shoes he had on. Well, he had on leather shoes that were kind of like, if not homemade, you know, they weren't through some retail outlet. They were from a shoemaker. And the way he laced them up, everything started pointing to Bavaria. And yes, we went back to Bavaria, where he lived in the Bavarians, and there was a clockmaker, either his father, he wasn't himself a clockmaker, but there was a shoemaker, a clockmaker, chalet type home, which he described, weather conditions, family members. And after I'd broken the ice with him that much, I mean, I was learning too that this is a way to identify, you know, if you're in sandals, or if you're barefoot, or if you're in wingtips or cowboy boots, you know, that puts you into a picture where you don't have to, it doesn't have to be such an obligation to the person that's being regressed, you know, to remember everything clearly, because my experience myself being regressed is that you kind of struggle with it, and the guide may not be giving you enough help. So I just developed techniques like that to help them. And this guy, I thought we were at the dead end when he wouldn't get off his graphic charts and stuff, and Shazams and stuff that he was seeing that weren't people or nature. It was just engineering related. So, and I took him back to a very primitive lifetime when he was barefoot and wearing a loincloth, basically, and long hair, kind of dark complexion, and he had a horse. And the bridle was of grass, vines or grass, or, you know, he couldn't remember very much. He wasn't very smart in that life. He was a very primitive man, and he was young. He was adolescent to mid-teen, somewhere in there. And he just didn't have much awareness of the world, or very much outside of it, just his immediate little sphere. And I suspect that primitive people didn't know much more than that. So this is the engineer from Lockheed, and I took him to Bavaria, and then I took him back to what might have been a Plains Indian. It might have been Central or South America. He didn't know where he was. Yeah. And he didn't have enough knowledge that I could probe and try to create the culture or anything. He just didn't know much. He just thanked me profusely when I left, you know, to go home, and he was just so grateful because he had been able to experience this. Yeah.
What percentage of people would you say are easy subjects, and what's the most common? Is it first timers tend not to have a solid set of memories, kind of like what you just described, without additional guidance?
Well, educated men are the hardest subjects because they won't shut off their conscious mind. They just won't relax enough to give up control. They want to control their thoughts. They don't want anybody else telling them what to think or where they are. So men with college educations are the most difficult, although I just, in that instance, I demonstrated that it can be done. But I'm one of the educated men that have a difficult time just at that time, and I have not continued to do this. You know, this was in the end of the 60s, 68, 69. I have not regressed anybody since I did some regressions when you were just a child, and we lived in Colorado Springs in the Broadmoor area, and we were trying to start a little business called the Creative Life Institute, in which we would help people develop the ability to create their own lives. And part of it is through the mind, obviously. The major part is through how you think, what your attitudes are, what your consciousness is of the world, and of yourself, and of your fellow man, and of your creator. So I still have I still think that we had a great idea, your mother and I, and that maybe we weren't old enough, mature enough to make it work, but it's still a great idea to help people in that way. So we had people, I don't know if you remember the house we lived in there, but it had a huge lower level, a basement, had a rec room in it, and an area where people could just lay out on the floor. So we advertised through I don't know, like an advertising bulletin that's free and comes around every week or so, and we'd get 2-3 people at a time. We would just do it on a Saturday afternoon, and they would come and just curious, spend a little time talking with them, you know, after we met, and build a little credibility, you know, show that I wasn't going to hurt them or anything, that this was all something that they could benefit from. And I remember a couple of women that came together. I regressed them together. And then while they were both very relaxed, I would ask one some questions and get her moving back in her mind, you know, to that time. And one of them had a problem with, she'd been abused, and she, even though I tried to keep everything happy, she did get to a point in this regression where she started crying, and I had to get her out of there right away.